Hey, hi, I'm Jane Frizzell, and this is Steinbrecht Sessions. And I think it's session 17, which is amazing to me that it's 17 weeks that we've been doing these line upon line, precept upon precept studies and paying attention to what this man told us about ride your horse forward and set it straight. I'm sorry, I am not a newscaster, and I know I'm supposed to look at that, but I'm not good at it. I do know how to ride a horse though, and many of you do too. But we can always do it better. So now we're going to talk about, okay, so this section that's coming up. Last week, we talked about spurs, like what are they actually for, and what he told us. And he uses the word obedience, the horse's obedience to the spurs. Now, this is a trigger word for so many in the recent generations of hyper offendedness. Obedience is not bad. Obedience means agreement, understanding, and that they want to. You know, if I have an obedient horse, he wants to know he wants to understand the instructions and do them. And that is a decision that he makes. So it's not a bad word. So I'm going to read what he's saying here. This obedience of the horse, which is brought about initially by its respect of the spurs, must be gradually converted into trust and attachment to his master for the relationship between the two to be correct. So the spurs are a gateway to trust and attachment. And when the spurs are used judiciously and for what purpose that they are really for, to make the horse loose and make his hindquarters matched right and left in mechanics and effort, and to strictly supervise their tracks, that they never consider to stray from the intended line. Then the horse, what happens is the horses start to, they like the feeling and they like understand. So my little spur here, see my little pencil? I think of my spurs like the eraser end of my pencil. Oh, you need to get a little more straighter. Oh, this is a little centimeter wide here. Oh, my darling. And no, it's a centimeter wide. Oh. It doesn't mean to get a centimeter wide on the, you just go do. And then they're like, oh, and then they realize that the little spurs are correcting centimeter by centimeter, and that it matches the rider's eyes and the weight of the seat, and it all agrees, like the line and her eye and her weight and the panty lace and her hand and my bit are all going in the same direction on the same line. That is a horse he's going to be happy to do it because it all makes sense. So I believe that the air quote trainers who are fostering or promulgating this species of like vicious anti-spur people that won't even pause to hear what they're for the well-being of the horse overall. I hate the people. I do. I don't want to deal with them, but aren't we to blame their instructors or their gurus or their Facebook group admins or whoever it is that is letting this shit spread? Okay, now the reason I do have something a little different planned for today, but I want to bring this up before I go into the little bit that's a little different. He goes on to say, this is accomplished if the rider limits and refines his actions, the more the horse, through measured and gradually increased exercises, gains in ability and willingness to obey his aids. I would add gains in understanding ability and willingness to obey the aids. And I think he probably assumed that and didn't leave the word out. So then he starts a sidebar that he has to address it. But it's food for the vicious ones. If, in overcoming resistance, the rider is always diligent to practice moderation and fairness, that is, he will not resort to unnecessarily hard punishments for impetuousness, nor will he make demands which exceed the horse's capabilities. He will not lose the horse's trust, even if he must be perhaps strict here and there. Perhaps strict here and there. We have to be, it's a willful, athletic, boisterous youngster. We want to preserve that. You go, oh, my darling, let's go on the straight and narrow. Everyone that I associate with and all of the people in my program, I've vetted to make sure that they're sensible enough to understand this kind of thought here. And they're not brutal, nor are they overindulgent. The next section, which is the rest of a paragraph and then an entire paragraph on page 76, he has to go to it. He has to address it. And he's going to talk about the noble horse as a brave and intelligent creature and how terrible humans are. And I want to say right now, and I am going to talk about this paragraph in more depth in another moment or at another time, because this is an example. And there's 3 or 4 paragraphs like this. I want to show you this. Okay, see this thing? Let me see. Look. All this, and then see, it's thick. It's over 250. How many pages? It's over 300 pages. Okay. It's a dense text. There are 3 or 4 paragraphs in here that the dilettantes and the activists and the influencer rider culture that I call the IRC have latched onto and use this man's single paragraph that is in the context of training horses to be obedient to spurs. They turn it into their activism mottos and use paragraphs like this as virtue signals for themselves, like the riders who, you know, they use it as virtue signaling, basically. They use it for their own virtue signaling instead of for information that a learning rider should hear. A lot of them know it intuitively because they've been brought along well. You know, if you have to tell someone that the horse is a noble, intelligent, and brave creature, you shouldn't have to tell anyone. So I am going to address this next section coming up, but I'm going to think about it another week, because when this guy and the other dead men, start talking about the character of a rider and the character of a horseman, these are the sections, paragraph passages in these magnificent instruction manuals that have been like cut up like in a chop shop, like a stolen car, and then they break it up for parts. These are the parts that the IRC, the influencer rider culture, is using without studying Ride Your Horse Forward and Set It Straight. He's going to say all this stuff, all this character, nobility, bravery, sweetness, sort of insipid stuff, in the context of using your spur to teach your horse to straighten. Positional, not motivational. That's what a spur is for. So this is going to bring me to what I wanted to talk about today. And that is what he says. When he says on page 128, all of us in this program have talked about it. We talk about it frequently. Moreover, the hindquarters must be first made flexible individually until they have been prepared for simultaneous bending by alternating exercises. So we address each hindquarter individually with alternating exercises to prepare them for bilateral, i.e. simultaneous bending or load bearing collection. This is, I'm just going to read it out loud. It's something that I wrote / said in public. How did I say it? A long time ago, like not 2020, 5 years ago. Okay. And what I said is, I am not seeing enough deliberate engagement on command. When I sit on a horse, the way I sit, loading one side or the other, if I sit on the left side, that should make him yank his hoof to his tummy. But nothing or very little is happening, or only somewhat happening. And these horses are often responding like a teenager mumbling a response. Sounds like a case for vitamin S. So that is deafness. And that is no. That's not obedient. And that isn't wonderful. That isn't going to make a horse that's happy with himself. Engagement is something we can address directly. We don't necessarily have to, quote, wait for it to develop, or be all fake patient about it, or be a more perfect rider, or have better hands, or a better soul, or better intention, like it's some distant things that only the greats have, or that we sometimes occasionally, like accidentally have. Engagement is called up by the weight of our seat. Any horse can understand, if it's explained logically, that when he feels weight, the seat aid, on one side or the other, that he ought to load up his upper hip joint more. He ought to load up his top joints more. What does develop? So you can explain that in 2 minutes to them. This means this. What does develop and does take time is the amount of weight, his understanding of its instruction, and his ability to commit to the engagement or load instantly. At the beginning, I may have to sit my whole self on one side for him to even notice that I've done so. Later, I can just drop 1 gram on one side or the other. Now, when I say later, I'm meaning weeks and months, not decades, not years. I always am going to be reducing, it's descend les dés, reduction of aids, constantly reducing the aids. If they don't understand, I can revert to the voice. But I want it to end out, like the French say, that a tiny weight oscillates a fine balance. What I'm saying here is don't go around for years making somewhat lateral work, or drifting sideways, hoping or waiting for the 3 days the clinician is there to help. Teach the horse what the weight aid means and keep it fresh, which means test it and tune it. I've not yet met a well-trained horse that came from Europe who didn't understand the Sesame Street version with my little twig, will then say, my weight means the same, buddy. They get off, they get unloaded, they do their 3 days in Miami, they're here, I touch them, this is my weight, and they go, yeah, I know. Okay, so we're good. They all know it. They know it already, and so do all the horses that come through this place. He knows to flex his joints, his upper hip. Remind him. P.S. There has to be engagement for throughness. The engagement of the upper joints, the coxofemoral articulation by load bearing, anchors the base of the spine. It's mandatory. And back to what I started with Steinbrecht's moreover, where is that? Moreover, the hindquarters must first be made flexible individually until they've been prepared for simultaneous load bearing by alternating it. Okay. We have to do each side separate first before we do both. And this does tie into what he's saying about our spurs are to make the hindquarters operate uniformly, that they match in mechanics and power, and to strictly supervise their tracks so that they don't vary from the intended line during engagement. So engagement can be connected in their mind, they connected with effort, and it's hard, so they give up. And then they go, oh, I'm going to put my foot a little wide so I have a wider base of support. And you say, no, my darling, you must keep on the straight and narrow. You see what can you follow along what I'm saying and what happens in the course of training? And I don't say narrow your tracks to, what is the width of 2 feet, of 2 hooves? I don't say that on day one. We work into it. They get more and more narrow as the upper joints become more flexible, and then the footprints become more narrow. Do you see how that works? I can't explain it biomechanically because I'm not a veterinarian. But this is the stuff that biomechanical people should be considering. Okay, so one side or the other, before bilateral engagement, we make the hindquarters flexible and strong and agile, one side or the other, and that is the pan scale activity of the weight of our seat, of the weight of the seat aid, its weight, pan scale, one side or the other. Okay, so that is what I wanted to throw into this mix, because he keeps it's very relevant to the use of the spurs, and it also correlates with this idea that the spurs, this obedience of the horse, which is brought about initially by respect of the spurs, is then gradually converted into trust and attachments to his master for the relationship to be considered correct, because the spurs initially explain to him about making his hindquarters match, especially when I start adventuring out onto the straight line, right? I'm doing one or the other hindquarters, and then I start adventuring onto the straight line, and he's like, shit, that's hard. Connecting this thing with some effort in my own mind. And I go, I know, my darling, but just try for 2 more meters. You see? That's how the position is initially said to him until he starts to do it on his own. So I call spurs the gateway to trust and attachment. I don't want what's going to come up in the next discussion to become turned into fodder for IRC virtue signaling. So I'm going to deal with that next week. I'm going to figure out a way to deal with it really well, to maybe put some sort of, booby trap, so that if they find the paragraph, they're not going to try to turn it into their own thing, because he's talking about stuff that people don't want to say I use my spur. I say, if you don't use your spur and know how they are used, then that is not loving horses.